Hello everyone, welcome to What the Tax, a UNDP podcast series organized as part of the Taxpayer SDGs initiative. I'm Hakshala David, your host, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to the 5th episode that we will be launching today. This episode is being done along the margins of the National Tax Dialogue, which is being currently organized in Sri Lanka, where we hope to unpack a different set of themes that are central to taxation. One such theme that is central to it is the conversation around tax morale, social contract, and inequalities. And to discuss this in detail, I'm so excited to have here today Mr. Alex Cobham, Economist and Chief Executive of the Tax Justice Network. Alex has been and is a global voice in terms of articulating the importance of why it is important to curb illicit financial flows, effective taxation for development, inequalities, for example. And this is the conversation that we would like to unpack in detail today as well. So hi, Alex. Welcome to this episode organized as part of our podcast initiative. Thank you so much for doing this today with us.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Alex, so before we unpack the conversation around tax morale, social contract, and inequalities, I'd like to give you a little bit of context in terms of why we are going to talk about what we are going to talk about. I'm sure you would know already, but in terms of how Sri Lanka has evolved over the decades, from the 1950s to the 1980s, Sri Lanka did have a very good proportion of our taxes as part of the GDP, which resulted in us having allocation towards health, education, subsidized food, which resulted in Sri Lanka being a model welfare economy with high human development indicators for a low-income country. At a time where it was around 1978, we're talking about a tax to GDP ratio which was around 25%. And then cut to, you see a gradual decline over the years, over the decades, where the tax to GDP ratio has declined significantly and rapidly owing to structural issues where the political economy is also central to it. And during the 2021 year period, we're talking about a government revenue to GDP ratio which stood at about 8.3%, which was in fact one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. So my first question to you is, based on your global experience, what really results in this kind of a decline and what makes a low tax to GDP ratio?
It's a really good question. It's kind of an intriguing case because if you look globally and think about the decades since the 1950s, really, where we mainly have kind of consistent data for a large number of countries, you almost never see a decline of that sort. So you can think about, say, 15% of GDP as a rough rule of thumb. If you're below that, the state is struggling to have the resources to provide basic functions. And so it's easy to get kind of trapped in that space where the state can't do enough for people, in a sense, to justify its taxes. It can't provide services. It can't provide an effective administration. And so people feel quite ambivalent about paying taxes, and that creates this sort of loop. But if you're above 15%, the tendency is to move further up, and especially if you're at the levels like 25% that you've talked about, it's very rare to come that far back down. Now, it's true in that moment, we had a set of things happen, including the COVID pandemic and the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both of which contributed in different ways quite significant economic shocks. And a lot of countries did see their tax to GDP ratios fall. But in almost every case, there was a rebound after a couple of years. In Sri Lanka, what had happened was that the biggest drop had happened before any of those shocks. And so there hasn't been really a rebound at all. So there, I think, and you'd know better than I, but from the outside, it looks like almost an act of vandalism. The decisions that were taken prior to the pandemic to cut tax after tax at a time when the tax to GDP ratio was already significantly lower than it had been historically. And in some ways, you could say Sri Lanka is an outstanding case on the positive, in that throughout decades of civil conflict, it actually managed to maintain relatively high tax to GDP ratios in a relatively functional state. But that's then undone, deliberately it appears, by the set of policies over a period that effectively mortgage the future, I think we can say. And the challenge now for this government and any future government is really, how do you rebuild everything, not just raising more tax. Tax is almost, obviously I think tax is very important, but it's almost a symptom of a well-functioning state and society as much as it is an outcome. And the issue, as much as anything, it's not just the technical fixes that are needed, it's the social changes. How do you recover the trust? And well, this is what we'll talk about, I think, but how do you rebuild trust in a state that delivers for the people, to the extent that people feel more positively about paying their taxes and holding the state accountable for what it does with that money?
Absolutely. So when you talk about rebuilding that trust, I recall during one of your earlier interviews, you mentioned that tax is the glue that binds together the social contract. What do you mean by that, Alex?
So look, the social contract can be thought of quite narrowly as, people pay taxes and governments provide services, but that's really to miss the bigger piece of what it's all about. But we talk about the 4 R's, or actually these days now the 5 R's of tax. So revenue and redistribution, I think everyone's pretty clear. Taxes raise money and they can allow you to challenge inequalities in different ways if you get it right. Repricing is the 3rd R. That's about changing the price of things like tobacco consumption or carbon emissions that have wider social damage. The 5th R, recently introduced, is reparations, recognising that tax can play a significant role in actually allowing high-income countries, former imperial powers, to make a serious contribution back for the damage they did in that imperial period. But the 4th R, the one you're asking about, and this is the one that it kind of all revolves around, is representation. You might have heard the American cry for independence from the British Empire was no taxation without representation. But the evidence actually tells us it's the other way around. There's no representation without effective taxation. It's not that people love paying tax, and it's almost, in fact, because nobody really, maybe I do, but very few people really like paying tax. But because of that, when we pay tax, we are empowered and annoyed and encouraged to hold the government to account, to think the government is spending my money, what are they doing with it? So what we find over time, and this is almost the strongest result in this whole literature we have, governments that take a larger share of their budget from tax revenues, so more of their spending comes from tax, over time are governments that become more accountable, less corrupt, more representative. So the effect of paying tax, in a sense, is magic, right? We don't just end up with governments that have more money, we end up with governments that spend the money better in our interests. And so that's why we talk about, and I should mention my new book, we talk about tax as a social superpower, right? Because it's the thing that allows us, when we get it right, to live better, healthier, longer, happier lives together, rather than short, nasty lives on our own, trying to fend for ourselves. That's the way in which tax is the glue in the social contract. But we have to get it right. And it really requires a lot of both technical and more political decisions to be got right. And that's really the challenge.
Absolutely. That's amazing that you say that. When you talk about the superpower, what kind of ingredients do you think that is needed in order to attain the tax morale that we need? within that broader social contract from a taxpayer's point of view, but also from the collectors or the policymakers' point of view as well?
So we have quite good evidence on what sort of taxes are most important. And it's direct taxes. So it's taxes that we pay on our incomes or our wealth, or that companies pay on their profits, rather than taxes on consumption, for example, or taxes on trade. Those sorts, indirect taxes on consumption like VAT, we tend not to notice so much as taxpayers. And that makes it politically easier for governments. But actually the effect over time is quite damaging. When we're paying direct taxes, the ones that we notice most, the ones that are most salient to us, the ones that annoy us most, in effect, we are more empowered by it. So there's a really good analysis that shows, over time, it's the share of direct taxes in particular in government spending that's really significant, and the one that drives better governance and less corruption. But it's more than that. It's also, if you have a government with the same total spending budget, but more of the money behind it comes from tax and comes from direct taxes in particular, that government will be spending more on things like health and less on things like defence. But it's better, even. For a health budget, a public health budget of the same size, if more of the underlying budget comes from tax, and particularly from direct taxes, the same amount of spending on health, turns out it generates better health outcomes for society because the spending is more inclusive. And that's this magic of tax, again, right? Because of the way that the money is raised, it actually makes the money more valuable. And so at the individual level, what we see with direct taxes, people who pay more of their income in direct tax, but not in indirect taxes like VAT, when it's direct taxes, people individually have a greater sense of what's called tax citizenship. They feel they are part of the society. They feel they're contributing to the state, but also that the state owes them accountability for how they spend that money. So all of this together, these processes really reinforce each other when we get the taxes right. And when we turn away from that, we start cutting direct taxes, maybe because it's politically easier, or maybe we have pressure from companies, and we're listening to that. And instead we put the pressure on VAT, on indirect taxes that make up a much bigger share of the income for low-income households. So we're driving inequalities to be worse, but at the same time, we're raising less revenue and we're making government less representative. We're making that social contract channel work less well. So all of these things that are often politically easier for a government with a really short horizon, thinking about the next election and nothing else, turn out to be really damaging. And so we need somehow to start these conversations about the type of government we want, the type of state we want in the longer term, and take tax decisions based on that, and explain to people, we're going to tax you in a way that's more visible, that's more annoying, but actually better, and it will empower you to hold government to account.
I think you also touched on the factors that erode the tax morale as well. And I think it leads to a nice segue into the next question that I want to ask you about corruption. Of course, corruption, which is now taking sophisticated forms as each day goes by, where it can also plausibly facilitate tax evasion, and it also results from a weak tax collection system as well. And the direct and the indirect consequences are multifold, as you would already know, be it in terms of the implications on the rule of law, human rights, how it affects government spending, like you touched on earlier, the trust and this tax citizenry that you talked about as well. So Alex, from your point of view, what is this ecosystem of tax evasion and how is it connected to corruption?
So that we tend to talk about, since 2015 at least, the idea of illicit financial flows as a kind of umbrella term. So that covers capital flows across borders where either the capital itself comes from illicit sources or the transactions are illicit in some way. So that includes things like grand corruption, and simply stealing from the state, stealing public assets, or giving false public contracts in order to take the state's revenues. But it also covers tax avoidance and tax evasion, both by multinational companies and by wealthy individuals, and a set of related things that are around kind of cheating market regulations, where there might be regulations against having a monopoly position. For example, you can hide the ownership and actually have an invisible monopoly. So in these different ways, you see a set of common elements, and I would say all of this is corrupt, effectively. But it's corrupt not in the way that, perhaps in the 1980s, there was a view of corruption that this is a problem in low-income countries, right? And it's really about public officials not behaving well. That's part of corruption. But once we understand this bigger picture of illicit financial flows, and that all of these things are eroding public funds and weakening the standards of governance, worsening corruption across the board, we see them all as a piece. And then you ask the question, okay, what's driving this? What are the common factors behind all of these types of abusive, illicit flows? And it's not in low-income countries at all. The consistent factor is financial secrecy. It's financial secrecy that allows you to hide who owns a company or another sort of legal vehicle, or who owns a bank account, or whether people are transacting with independent companies or actually they're transacting with themselves and just pretending not to be. The secrecy that underpins that is key across the piece, and key to all of the offshore tax abuse by individuals and by multinational companies. Now, who provides the secrecy? Answer: overwhelmingly, it's countries that are members of the OECD, it's the high-income countries and their dependent territories. The biggest actor by far is my own country, the United Kingdom, both through the City of London, but also the set of dependent territories from the Cayman Islands to Jersey that the UK effectively exerts control over. So we see a kind of completely different geography of corruption. And the question then becomes, thinking of that from a Sri Lankan perspective, not so much how do we make sure people here behave better, because this is the same problem everyone has everywhere. We need to have the kind of transparency measures in place to be able to hold our public officials and our governments to account. But that's true everywhere. There's nothing unique to Sri Lanka in that. The question, though, becomes, how do we fight the provision of the financial secrecy over there that's driving corruption and tax abuse over here? And for this, really the kind of work that's developed since the Sustainable Development Goals set a target in 2015 to curb illicit financial flows. And it's been, slow but steady work at the United Nations on that. And a key piece is understanding the vulnerabilities. And so you can say, let's look at, let's say, Sri Lanka's exports of commodities. Where are they going? That are more places that are more secretive and less secretive. Where are the biggest risks? And then we can look at direct investment or portfolio investment or banking flows and do the same analysis. In each case, we can say, right, these are the big secrecy risks, and this is where we really need to focus if we're doing audits, or if we're going to go and check the prices that people have declared, or we want to ask questions about bank accounts being held in other countries. It's probably not India, but it might be Switzerland, or in exports. Again, it's probably not India, but it might be the United Arab Emirates. We need to really look at, given the level of secrecy there, we need to say, okay, these are transactions we need to be more careful of. If we want to understand and start to unpick the degree of corruption that allows people, in one way and another, to take what should be public funds and to undermine our governments while they're doing it, then that vulnerability analysis is key. And starting to target our policy responses according to where the secrecy risks are is what gives us a way into it.
Absolutely. Based on what you said in terms of where financial secrecy is being driven, and where it is felt. There's a difference between the two, right? Based on that, how do you see the intensity of this impact panning out between the developed countries and the developing countries? Would you say the intensity is rather higher in developing countries such as Sri Lanka, for example?
Yeah, look, there's kind of two ways of looking at that question. The best data that we have, or the best estimates, are around tax abuse. And so every year in the Tax Justice Network, we publish the State of Tax Justice report. And that has estimates of the revenues that each country is losing to the tax abuse of multinationals and of wealthy individuals, but also estimates of the damages that each country is imposing on others. So it allows us to look at both sides. Now, what you see in terms of the revenue losses, the picture is very clear. In absolute terms, if we look at just the number of dollars, it's high-income countries that are losing overwhelmingly the greatest volume. So in total, those losses are about $480 billion a year. Call it just about $500 billion. Now, the great majority of that is lost by high-income countries. But if we look at the losses as a share of current tax revenues, it's in lower-income countries that it's a much higher degree of loss. The intensity is much greater. And just to give one stat that kind of sums that up, the losses on average for high-income countries are equivalent to about 9% of their public health budgets. So it's significant. And that's it's a loss that would certainly be worth recovering. But in lower income countries, it's roughly 49%. So about half of the public health budget on average of each country is being lost every year to these two types of tax abuse. So what that translates into in terms of things like unnecessary child mortality, maternal mortality, the most basic indicators are significantly higher than they should be. Because 9% of the health budget in the UK, it matters, but it doesn't translate nearly as directly into human damage. But 49% of the health budget in Sri Lanka really does make an impact in terms of even things as stark as death. And so that's why, although the dollars may be being lost mainly over there, it's the share of tax revenues, the share of public spending that we really need to focus on. And then the intensity picture looks very different.
Absolutely. Building on that, Alex, tax is self-reported in Sri Lanka. So based on your global experience, what is the global best practice and how do you think countries such as Sri Lanka can adopt that?
So self-reporting in itself has quite positive aspects. You need a tax system in which people feel empowered and feel part of it. If it's coercive, it's no good. You might make more money in 1 year, as it were, but the damage to the social contract will far outweigh that. On the other hand, we also know that, because of that positive dynamic, people consistently pay much more in tax than would be predicted by kind of basic economic models. If you look at just the penalties for being caught and the chances of being caught if you don't pay enough tax, actually people should be much more uncompliant than they actually are, and that's in every country around the world where that's been looked at. People really believe in paying tax, and want to contribute. So self-reporting, in principle, is not a bad idea, but we also know that there are quite significant things that shift compliance. And really it's two things. Firstly, do people think that government is spending the money well? So, if your sense is that the money is being used to address inequalities, to help people in poverty, to provide inclusive public services, you're much more likely to be compliant. And then secondly, whether you think everybody else is complying. Nobody wants to be the only fool, right? Nobody wants to pay tax if everyone else is just having a laugh and not doing it. And so for that, it's really important that people are confident that the right amount of tax is being paid. And self-reporting can open the possibility that other people aren't reporting fairly. And then you say, well, so why should I? I don't want to be the only fool. And what we find in the evidence, it's pretty clear. When there's a kind of a third-party source providing information to the tax authority, so for example, if you are employed and your employer automatically every month tells the tax authority how much they paid you, or better yet, they remit automatically your tax, so you don't have to think about it. But even just if they tell the tax authority, your tax compliance, on average, goes up something like 7 or 8 times. So that the effect on the losses to non-compliance is dramatic. And this is particularly true. So a lot of countries have that arrangement where the employer tells the tax authority. We tend not to have that for other sorts of income. And what that means is that people who are in a standard paid job tend to be much more tax compliant, almost by default. People who have a lot of income from investment, for example, or from banks, savings, particularly where that's offshore, and they don't think the tax authority is going to be told about it, are in a very different position. And so one of the big things in the last 10 years has been introducing automatic exchange of information where financial institutions somewhere else, whether that's in Switzerland or the UK or India, would tell the tax authority in Sri Lanka or wherever it would be about the financial holding, the account holdings of people. That information on its own, where it's in place, again has a dramatic impact because it takes you beyond self-reporting. If people know that the tax authority is going to be informed about their foreign bank account, then they're much more likely to declare it themselves, so their self-reporting becomes better. Even if the tax authority probably doesn't actually have the capacity to go and use all of the data it gets and check it, just the fact it's there means that people are more compliant, people behave more pro-socially because there's that little check there. So that's the kind of measures that I think we need to be thinking about, and really in every country, improving that type of third-party reporting in order that the context in which people then make the decisions about self-reporting and about compliance are better. Everyone is confident that everybody else is paying fairly, and so everyone is happier themselves to pay fairly. Feels like it's not just a coercive extraction, the government taking something from them, but it's a position we're all in society. We're all in it together, and we're all contributing together more or less fairly. And only, over time does that build the social contract and, all of those magic elements of tax as the social superpower that we've talked about, bit by bit, but we get there.
Absolutely. You talked about vulnerabilities earlier, and I would like to build on that and hear your views about inequalities as well. So UNDP recently did a study on the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index together with the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, where it was revealed that over half of the population are multidimensionally vulnerable. So from that, Alex, how do you see taxation playing a role with regards to addressing inequalities?
So, we can think about economic and political inequalities being very closely linked. The economic ones are sort of easiest to get our hands around, and just that type of analysis, really showing very clearly who is most vulnerable. And I would imagine, though I haven't seen the study, but what we find pretty consistently around the world is there are groups, including women, who are disproportionately exposed to the risks of poverty, but also, ethno-linguistic groups, racialized, marginalized groups, people living with disabilities. It's fairly systematic, and it's because our systems fail in the same fairly systematic ways. So, for example, when we have government policies that have moved us towards indirect taxes, things like VAT, instead of putting the emphasis on corporate taxes or capital gains taxes and wealth taxes, we end up in a situation, and this again unfortunately is really common across the world, where low-income households tend to be the ones that pay the highest share of their income in tax. And so the tax system itself is making those inequalities, those vulnerabilities worse. Now, it's raising revenues for public spending, which can be offsetting, can make things better to some extent. But that really depends how inclusive the public services like public health are, for example, and whether there are cash transfers particularly targeted at low-income households. And in many cases, they don't come close to the damage that's done by indirect taxes. And so the set of economic issues is pretty clear. And again, that systematic element, because we know that lower income households in general are more likely to be headed by women, are more likely to include disabled people, to include marginalised ethnic groups, and so on. So it's the people who are already most exposed tend to be made more vulnerable by the tax system when it works badly. So we need to think about how we flip that, how we put the emphasis on direct taxes that are more progressive, that put more emphasis on the highest income households and the highest wealth households that can really afford it. But the other aspect is the political inequalities, because the other thing we know about our tax systems is that people who pay more direct taxes tend to feel more politically empowered. So the fact that we have lower income households being the ones who pay most of their income in tax, but actually it's mainly indirect taxes, they are not being politically empowered in the same way as people in high-income households who are actually paying less of their income in tax, but more of it in direct taxes. So it's those high-income households who end up feeling like they've got the right to hold government to account, to demand things from government, when actually lower-income households, people who are paying more of their income in tax, don't get that impact in the same way. So when we get it wrong, our tax systems are driving both economic inequalities to be worse and the political inequalities. And we really have to flip that if we're going to have a chance of empowering people to demand that government works with them, that we have a social contract that starts to lift people out of that multidimensional poverty and vulnerability, and focusing particularly on those groups that are systematically most at risk.
Absolutely. What do you see as the role of the UN with the new UN Tax Convention coming in, be it in terms of addressing the inequalities that you just described right now, or the other themes that we talked about earlier as well? How do you see the UN playing a role in this regard?
The role of the United Nations in tax is potentially absolutely pivotal. I mean, it might change the world that we're living in. The possibility of a UN tax convention that's now being negotiated would give us, particularly because it's a framework convention, like the framework convention we have on climate change, for example. So it's not just a one-off legal instrument that makes a set of things better. It also creates a framework body which can then have conferences of the parties in years to come. And we know that we need that with tax because people are always finding new ways to cheat, new ways to damage the taxing rights of other countries. And so having that possibility over time to negotiate rules in future is fundamental. Doing it at the United Nations would be the first time ever that we've had a globally inclusive forum to do that. So the first type of inequalities that this addresses is the inequalities between countries. You know, I've talked about how lower income countries lose the highest share of their current tax revenues due to those failings of the international tax system. But I haven't talked so much about the fact that it's OECD member countries and their dependent territories that are responsible for more than 3/4 of the revenue losses that everybody else suffers. And up until now, or at least since 1960, it's the OECD that has been responsible for setting international tax rules, even though it only has 38 members, and the rest of the world effectively has to kind of accept these rules or get into a big fight. So we've had this situation where the countries most responsible for international tax abuse, and I think we can extrapolate illicit financial flows more broadly, the countries most responsible have also been the ones who are members of the club that sets the rules, that determine the taxing rules and the financial transparency measures that we have and so on, the rules that allow them to do this. And the countries that are most exposed to the damage caused by this are the countries that don't have a voice at the OECD, don't have a vote, are not members, are not able to influence. So moving this into a United Nations setting is dramatic. It's what we've been campaigning for at the Tax Justice Network, along with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, which is the umbrella body for all of the mass mobilization organizations on tax justice around the world. We all agreed there was a fight in 2015 at the Financing for Development Summit in Addis in Ethiopia to get a global tax body, and the OECD countries blocked it. And so in 2016, the Tax Justice Network and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice began thinking and strategizing about how we would challenge this. And since then, the common goal has been a UN tax convention. And it's really been in order to address these inequalities between countries. But the other piece, and this is sort of more, I think, your question, is about the inequalities within countries. And this is fundamental for that too. The way that the international tax rules fail is very systematic. It undermines the ability of every government in every country, but disproportionately in lower income countries, to be able to tax directly. So you're left being able to tax indirectly on VAT, on trade, where you can control it. But your ability to tax on incomes, on capital, wealth, on profits is badly hindered. Because as soon as people are transacting internationally, or can hold their wealth or shift their income streams offshore by creating companies or bank accounts elsewhere anonymously, as soon as that's possible, or you have rules that allow multinational companies simply to shift their profits away from the places they're actually carrying out the activity that makes those profits. As soon as you have all that, the ability of a government to pursue direct taxes, the most important taxes for the social contract and for redistribution, for raising revenues, as soon as you're in that position, you're very exposed. It's almost impossible to have national tax policies that don't actually make inequalities worse instead of fixing them. What the UN Tax Convention can deliver is effectively to re-establish the space for every national government in every country at every level of income to pursue progressive direct taxation to the level it wants. And the level it wants should be the level that the public demand. So that doesn't mean that everyone will do the same thing or everyone will have the same rates of tax, not at all. In fact, we may see a bigger divergence, because what we'll finally get to in this utopian outcome, at least that I'm hoping for, is a position where the public in every country in the world is able to choose the level and type of direct taxes as well as indirect taxes that they want, and hold their governments to account for delivering that. And that will allow us all really much more ability to influence the levels of public services we have, the levels of inequalities that we're willing to live with or that we want to curb, and ultimately how strong our societies are to live in. So this is, it can feel very far away, people negotiating a tax convention in New York, right? But actually has the potential to change for all of us the type of societies that we live in, and dramatically for the better. So the next few years are really, really pivotal for all of us and how those negotiations work through.
Absolutely. Oh, that's so inspiring to hear, Alex. Congratulations on all the work that you're doing and the wider team at the Tax Justice Network as well. I'm so humbled that you're here in person and you're doing the keynote address at the Tax Dialogue. I'm really excited to see what you have to share with the audience, these insights that you have shared with me today, and to the listeners of our podcast as well. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to share, final thoughts that you would like to leave with the audience? Anything about your new book, What Do We Know, and what should we do about tax justice?
Well, I would love everyone to read my new book, but honestly, no, I feel very honoured to be able to speak with you today and at the dialogue tomorrow. And I would just say, the progress we've had with the UN Convention, I hope it is inspiring to all of us, not because, something happened in a UN process, but because it kind of reflects civil society all around the world having made a collective demand and shifted something that, that we'd been told for decades actually was impossible. You'll never move this out of the OECD. That's how it is. Deal with it. Try and work to make things better at the OECD, but it's an impossible dream to take this to the UN. You're kidding yourself. Actually, no. When people work together, they can make things happen. The Africa group of countries at the UN has been particularly pivotal in leading this process, with the G77 countries supporting them. But behind that is African civil society, which has probably been the most collectively organised and the most focused on tax justice, since Tax Justice Network Africa was established in 2007. They've really driven this agenda. So it's about the power of people demanding change and actually making it happen. And that should be the thing. It's certainly what inspires me. I hope it's what inspires all of us. And in Sri Lanka, I hope the civil society, engaged in this and thinking, how are we going to make sure that our government, this one, the next one, all of them, are better, deliver for us. We've been through a terrible period, particularly in terms of tax, but this illustrates the importance of tax. Now we need to flip the script, use tax to make things better, the way that we know they can. That's,
Oh, thank you so much, Alex. That was extremely inspiring. Thank you once again for being here with us today. Hopefully we'll have you back again soon.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you really very much.
On that note, that's a wrap from our end. Thank you for watching, and we'll hopefully catch you soon at the next episode. Thank you.